Okay, so finally, time to spray that primer that I keep talking about. But, of course there would be a but. I just want to take care of a couple of housekeeping notes before I get started because I've already gotten some really good comments on the first episode, and there are a couple of things worth mentioning. I think everybody acknowledges that this is a fantastic kit, but there may be some accuracy issues. That's my air quotes, by the way. And I don't know if there's so much accuracy issues or reflections of an attempt by Tamiya to kind of account for all possibilities by including things that maybe didn't need to be there. Planning for future releases of later marks of Spitfires, or the simple fact that when it comes to Spitfires, you shouldn't bet money thinking you know the rules, because somebody is going to find an exception, and we'll talk about some of those along the way. But it is good to get people mentioning those things in the comments because we can all learn. So here's one. This little gizmo right here with the lever on it that you have to clip off for the A version is apparently the for the hydraulic pump that was used on, he said, landing gear, I think, if I recall correctly. And apparently that went away for whatever reason. I don't know, but they said take it away, and I didn't feel like having to paint it, so since I'm doing version A, it got removed, and now we all know a little bit more about what that gizmo is for. Now, another thing that is in question, and I've mentioned it already, is the flare racks for the seat there. And again, I haven't decided if I'm going to remove that or not, but you know, there's a lot of consensus that those should not be there on a Mark I. The other thing is the infamous Spitfire Crowbar. Again, quite a bit of consensus that it should not be there on a Mark I, but I'm not going to remove it for two reasons. One, I really honestly don't know when the crowbar appeared, and two, that door is going to be shut on mine, and that is going to be pretty much invisible. So not going to choose to care about that. Now, what you do, that's entirely up to you. If you feel strongly about removing it, then you should do that. It's going to be a little bit of a challenge, and it goes beyond the scope of this project on my part, and for this video, for sure. And we already talked about removing the bolts for the armor plate by the headrest, so don't have to worry about that. But I do need to fix this little goober that I created for myself. This is a little self-inflicted gunshot wound with the excessive extra thin that I had in that joint. So this is where my extra sharp file is going to come out. Now I know I talked about choosing a file when it's a flat surface, and yeah, that definitely is true. But I will also use them on curved surfaces because a really good one is, you know, when it's really sharp, it just cuts so well, and it's just good. It gives you a lot of control, and it's just good for, you know, for a lot of situations, even if they aren't planar. So, and you know, and they remove material pretty fast. So that's why I'm choosing to at least start dealing with this problem that way. Now, then I'm going to finish taken care of that with this 400 grit sanding board, which again is relatively rigid, but I'm just taking care to not create a flat spot. So I think that's a pretty good start. That at least removes the giant blob that was there. Now I do still have a little bit of an issue there where that panel line has been a little bit filled in. So got to deal with that. Now what's the trick there? This is something that's going to come up quite a bit once I glue the fuselage halves together and I start having to rejoin panel lines that are blurred out from filling the fuselage seam. But this is a tamiya razor saw. This comes as part of a set of them. And they come in two different thicknesses. This is the 0.15 millimeter thickness. And I love these for taking care of panel lines where I have to work over a convex surface. And this is definitely one of those situations. So what I'm going to do here is use the part of the panel line that's good as my guide to start things, and just very carefully start working that around towards the top where it's been filled in. It doesn't take a lot, but if it's not making a wide enough groove, then you can work the sides by angling the blade this way and that way, and that'll help you make a wider groove. But I feel pretty good about that, at least enough to squirt some primer on it. So there you go. You can take a look at that and you can see that that is pretty nicely restored. Now, one other thing that I had mentioned before was that this joint out here was a little bit proud for my taste. So I'm going to work that just a little bit. And my preferred method for this kind of thing, because again, it involves something that's sticking up that I want to shave down. I don't want to do a bunch of sanding, so I want something that gives me really good control. And so scraping is going to be my go-to method for something like this, because you can take down just very small amounts of material and you can keep it isolated to a very sort of narrow zone on either side of the joint. So I'm going to just work this a little bit. Okay, so I got that pretty well leveled off to satisfy me, at least for now, but I've got a little bit of swarf in a couple of these panel lines, and I want to just very quickly clean those out. So out comes another one of the Tamiya razor saws, and you can see one of the reasons that I love these is the same reason as I love the glue looper, because I can put it in these inexpensive X-Acto handles. I think I got these handles by buying a set of cheap X-Acto knives on Amazon. I think I got a dozen of them for something like 15 or 20 bucks. It was cheap, I remember that. And I just ditched the blades and replaced them with other tools. And that's been one of the smartest things I've ever done. Smartest bits of money I've spent on tools. Okay, so just cleaning that out. Now you can see I've got a little bit where I had a little bit too much glue in part of that line right there, so I'm going to take care of that as well. Now here's the thing, if you're doing something like this and you approach it very, very cautiously, always start where you've got enough panel line depth to guide the tool. And whether or not you push or pull is just kind of, for me that's situational. But it's really a matter of feel. And it's one of those things where I could talk about it all day, but until you just get some experience with it, it's just really hard to say a whole lot about it that you really just have to, I know I'm making a lot of sense. I'm kind of just babbling here because I'm trying to talk and concentrate on what I'm doing, because this is one of those things where there's penalty. You don't want to make things worse in the process of trying to make things better. There's a German word for that, actually, and it's pretty funny, but it's also like 13 letters long, and I don't ever remember it. But I'm just about there. And what you want to do, hopefully you can see from how I've approached this, is you're using the panel line that's full depth on either side of the area that you're trying to fix as your guide. And so what you might end up doing is approaching it like I did, a little bit from each direction. Like I started on this side, then moved over to this side, and finally ended up, meeting in the middle. And, if you do it right, then what you end up with is a panel line that's been properly restored like that one has. Okay? Now, if you still feel like you have a little bit of swarf in there, or if it's a little bit fuzzy, this is a thing that I mentioned before, and that is taking just a very little bit of extra thin. You don't want much because you don't want to flood the area, but just a little bit of extra thin, and brush it through that panel line, and that will melt the fuzz and any little, any really small particles. And now, if it'll focus, camera doesn't like these things that are neutral gray, you can see that we have a pretty decent looking joint there. But, and this is the reason why I'm doing all this right now before I prime, because we won't really know until we've got some primer on it. And I'm a big believer in the idea that it's never too early to start spot priming. So one of the tasks that I'll do when I start shooting primer is I will spot prime that joint. So, with all of this yakking about priming, it is time to finally actually do it, right? So let me talk about the tool I'm going to use for that. This is my trusty Iwata Neo airbrush. Okay, this is the TRN1, and yeah, it is it's, you know, you're probably looking at this thing going, that is a jalopy. Yes, it is not perfectly clean because I don't keep it surgically clean. You know, I don't care about paint on the outside of it. All I care about is it spraying properly? And I'm not going to get into a whole airbrush cleaning situation on this video series, but I have a video that where I go into depth and show in detail how I clean one of those things when I decide it's time to do that. And my rule is I shoot until it sprays funny, and then I do a field strip. If that's a month, if it's 3 months, if it's 3 weeks, whatever it is. I can tell when it starts acting weird, and I know it's time to take it apart and do a serious field strip. But in the meantime, I'm shooting lacquers like 95% of the time, and so I flush with lacquer thinner until it sprays clear. And I know that there's probably still a little bit in there, and I don't worry too much about that as long as the needle isn't sticking. Well, the needle sticking is a common thing. You know, you come back to the bench, and the worst thing is you forget to check, and you put some paint in, and you go to spray, and your needle will not move. Or, you know, the chuck just slides on the needle. That happens to me frequently, and so I did the farm boy solution. I got tired of it, so I just bent the needle so that the chuck can't slip, and now my needle is never stuck. I just got tired of fishing out the pliers to yank the needle out. One thing you can do if you don't want to go to such extreme measures is just try and have the rule of always running a little bit of lacquer thinner through the thing before you actually put paint in it. That will, at a minimum, tell you if the needle is stuck, and chances are if it is a little bit stuck, it'll free it up. And look, you know, if you're saying, oh well, you're just not keeping your airbrush clean, that's why your needle sticks. Look, I have had needles stick in airbrushes that I literally just finished field stripping. It's just a thing, especially if you use lacquer thinner. Sometimes you just get enough of it in there, and maybe there's a tiny little bit of paint or something, but it's enough to make the needle stick hard enough that, you know, with your needle chuck just being finger tight is enough to make the needle chuck slip, and then you're yanking it out with the needle out with pliers. Anyway, so to get on with the painting, I've got my compressor set right now on 15 psi because that's where I mostly spray, honestly. If I'm shooting MRP lacquer, which we'll get into later when it's time, I shoot that on the daily at about 15 psi. But really, I like 20 psi a little better for primer. It doesn't really, you know, you don't have to be exact about it, but what I do believe is in being consistent. Whatever you decide it is, 20, 15, 21, 21 and a half, just try to always be the same, because that removes one variable from your painting process. And so if you get into a situation where you're having issues, then you at least know what you can eliminate. So I am ready to go. Needle needle was nice and free. So again, I've got this Mr. Surfacer 1500 that I keep mixed up in this bottle, and that lets me just squirt it right into the airbrush cup, which is very handy. No pipettes were harmed during the filming of this episode. And it's time to just do a little bit of basic painting. And the first thing I'm going to do is I'm going to reshoot this area. Well, let me start with fresh plastic. And I would normally be shooting in my spray booth, but because I want to demonstrate a few things, I'm going to do it out here on my workbench with no ventilation. So hopefully I don't get super over lacquered and high and start babbling even more than usual. Anyway, a couple of things that I want to talk about as far as painting goes, okay? And this, you know, this is a thing that I see even more advanced model makers doing, and that's bad spray discipline, Okay, I think it's really important to behave as much like a machine as possible when you're painting for the most part. There are exceptions, okay? But in general, waving the airbrush around like crazy and just being all casual about it is a recipe for a bad paint finish. You may get away with it with just your primer, but by the time you stack up 2 or 3 or 4 layers of material, you know, all the way to the end of your process where you're doing a clear coat, chances are you're going to have some irregularities, and those are going to translate to you know, grainy finishes or rough, you know, textures or whatever. So I believe in being disciplined from the very beginning, and that means your basic spray method should be always at a right angle from the, you know, keeping your airbrush at a right angle to the work surface, moving at a steady speed and a constant distance, and making nice even passes. So the first thing I'm going to do is just blow a light dry layer, and you know, what am I, about 1.5 inches or 2 inches away? That's going to give me a relatively thin dry spray. And you can see, you know, for basic priming, that really is about all you need. But as you can see there, I've got some areas where I've done a little bit of work, and there's, you know, a little bit of evidence of sanding that shows there. So I'm going to want at least one more layer, and I'm going to want it to go on a little bit wetter. So what I'm going to do is move closer and maybe go a little slower, and my passes are going to be overlapping a lot more. And I try to overlap by, you know, 1/3 to 1/4. It's not exact. But the point being is, now you can see I put that on where it's more wet. So this is what I call spraying wet versus spraying dry. All right, if you spray back here and the paint looks flat as it's going on, that's spraying dry. If the paint looks like this as it's going on, that's spraying wet. And what I call normal spraying is, and this is a silly term that I just kind of came up with, is spraying on the dry line. And that's where, as you're spraying, it looks wet while you're shooting, and then almost immediately starts to flash off. And that's what I call normal spraying. And the point is that you have to be watching the spot. You have to be focused on that while you're shooting. So no matter whether or not you're shooting a really, really tiny spot, you know, you're really close in and spraying, you know, spraying really small, or whether you're back out here and you're really cranking the trigger and spraying wide and heavy, you really want the spot to behave the same way no matter what. All right, so that's a good solid 3 layers of primer on that, and hopefully that will fill in those areas where I did the sanding before. And that kind of gives you kind of some insight on what I consider to be basic spray discipline. So I'm going to repeat that over here on this thing, as the bottom part of the cockpit here, the very underneath floor part, has to also be painted. So again, just a quick shot of primer is all that needs. It really honestly does not need any more than that. That's just there to give you know, the color coat something to bite on. And what's also a good idea, if you do go for a second layer, is change direction. So I was going long ways at first. Now I'm going to come back, go crossways to that, and I'm going to spray a little bit wetter. And now I've definitely got a nice solid layer of primer on there. So I'll set that aside. Last thing real quick, because I know some people are going to bring this up, I've got this sub-assembly here and a couple of other little things where I installed some photo etch. And you may ask, well, what about, using metal primer and making sure that your, paint's going to stick to the photo etch and all that? Honestly, I don't worry about it. If it chips, it chips, but I don't have that problem too much because, in general, I'm dealing with stuff that I'm not going to touch ever again. And so I find that whatever primer I'm using stays put just fine, even on a photo etch part like that. So that's my answer on that particular topic. So, okay, I think that's about enough on, obviously don't get cat hair stuck in your paint no matter what you're doing. That's always a problem at my workbench. But at any rate, I think that's about enough discussion of priming. As usual, with pretty much all kinds of painting, it's a whole lot of lead up to a very short bit of actual work. So, when we come back, I will probably shoot some color on some of these parts. Okay, so I'm about done spraying all this primer, and before I clean this out, I want to just show you a small trick, okay? You can see in here these areas where I sanded the ejector marks off, and they're not perfect. I could have done a better job of sanding, but the bottom line is that it's pretty difficult to get a surface back to perfect unless you're going to just do a bunch of polishing. And even then, when you're dealing with bare plastic, you're going to find that stuff will not show up until after you spray primer on it, which again, for like the 300th time, is one of the reasons to use primer. Now, one thing you can do to help yourself is remember that with lacquer primer in particular, it's basically just super, super thin filler. And you can use that to your advantage, okay? I normally never spray more than 2 or 3 really light layers of primer on anything because it's just not necessary. But in a situation like this, where I would like to at a minimum, make whatever sanding I have to do a little easier, I may choose to use the primer as a spray-on filler. And this is where spraying really small comes in handy because, as you can see, I can spray a really small spot size even with this airbrush having a 0.5 millimeter needle. It's been sitting here, so my needles things are getting a little cloggy, not normally an issue, but I can spray a really small spot size, and so I can go in here and just not necessarily flood that area, but just spray some thick wet layers to kind of act as filler. And I'm not saying that I won't still have to come back and sand that. I mean, you can see that it's a little bit, it's a little bit goofy looking, but I now have material that I can sand down that will, help fill in those little scratches. And here's a good example of a place where I've got a little bit of that. Here, see where I did that scraping? You may be able to see it. There's a little bit of an area right above the line right here where I have some blade marks. So I'm going to just come back and go over that. A little more heavily right there to give me some sanding meat. So, just a little trick. Okay, so it's a few hours later and I have lots of parts here that have primer on them, and so let's go through and look at everything and see what the state of affairs is, since there are a few places where I did a little bit of work. So, the first one, that thing right there, maybe. I had to do a little bit of a fix on the top of that box. It's still slightly visible, but I think it'll be okay. All right, so there's that. I had a little bit of glue, super glue, that I discovered on this photo etch part after I sprayed the first layer of primer on it. And so I did what I always do. If I'm spraying and I see an issue like that, if it's something that I know I can take care of immediately, I stop what I'm doing right then and deal with it, which lacquers make that easy because they dry so quickly. And so what I did is I just stopped. I took my debonder on a Q-tip and just scrubbed all the primer and the super glue as well right off of that photo etch piece, and then resprayed it. So that's all done. Also, speaking of these formers right here, it's a pretty common thing with Spitfire kits to want to drill out all of those lightning holes, because that's what those are, all around the perimeter there. And it certainly can improve the looks, but I'm not going to do that on this one, not in 1/48 with the canopy closed. I just don't really feel like that's worth my time. But you know, it is a good little bit of realism to add if you're so inclined. So those look pretty good. Let's see. I scraped the seam off the top of that little oxygen bottle right there. It doesn't look too bad. I mean, it's, you know, yeah, it's a little bit flat, but look, that's going to happen. I mean, you can't scrape a parting line off without leaving a little bit of a flat spot. And if you're really serious about it, then you can go back and sand it to where it's curved. But again, what I'm looking to do here is just make sure that there isn't a flaw that's glaringly obvious. And I know that when it's all said and done, a slight bit of flatness there is going to be basically invisible, whereas a parting line witness will definitely not be. So that kind of governs my strategy. Okay, this right here, this was the sort of the one straight bit of priming where, you know, there hadn't been any body work done, and maybe now that I'm looking at it, of course, thanks a lot, Tamiya, for putting those ejector pin marks right there. Yeah, right there in the middle of that. I don't think those are gonna show enough to where I'm gonna worry about them, but yeah, ideally they probably should have been dealt with. But again, I'm probably not going to worry about it because that's underneath all of the cockpit guts, and it's just not going to show, even if it is in the right position fore and aft. Now you'll notice that I sprayed already some primer on these wheel wells. That honestly is because I just had some left over in my airbrush, and I was not going to waste it. So that's taken care of. All right. Let's see, I scraped the seam off and had a little bit of a divot left in this air tank, and you can look at that and see that even after my little super glue fix, there is still a slight divot. You can just see it right there. So am I going to probably worry about that? Yeah, probably not. But if I were going to, another round of, you know, super glue, or maybe the primer trick that I showed you is what I would do to fix that. Let's just see what happens if I just in the interest of testing finishing skills and methods, let's see what happens here. So this is a case where I will switch to a finer sanding sponge, and again also because this is a round surface and I'm now getting more towards, you know, where I really want it to be a final finish quality as opposed to you know, just doing body work. I'll grab this 800 grit Infini sponge and make a few passes over that. And because that's a little divot, I think if I get to the point where it's just bare plastic all around it and nothing left but a black spot, then I will know that I've polished the paint down to where it's flush. Now this is a 1000 grit sponge stick. Sorry I keep banging into the camera. I don't know how to not do that, but I have to have an optivisor on for doing this kind of stuff. And I have to be close to the work because of that, and the optivisor sticks out and bangs into the camera all the time. So, now, so again, this is where a magnifier and a really strong side light are valuable, because you can look at this and you can see that the difference, if there was a difference in the finish, okay, if that little spot of paint that's left where the divot was shiny, but everything around it was not shiny, meaning had been sanded, then we would know that that little divot was still low and that it would still maybe show with the next layer of paint. But because it's all uniform, I think I can safely say that that surface is all flush. So I didn't really necessarily have to do that. It is probably not going to show, but I think that's a good demonstration of how to diagnose your bodywork, so that by the time you get to the point of putting some color on it, you don't find yourself with a surprise flaw. And that's really important, especially when you are working with like metallic finishes, because you know they will show every single thing. All right, so that's a good little bit of cleanup done there. This instrument panel, bulkhead, all that stuff, that looks good. No issues there. The actual instrument panel just glues to the surface of that, and that'll be something we'll get to pretty soon. Let's see how this looks. I'm always afraid to look at super glued parts after the primer goes on, because that's when you really see whether or not you've got sloppy super glue application. And this is not too bad. You know, and again, these little foot pedal things are not going to show, so, but they're fine. And now the most important things. Let's take a look at this bit of work. Okay, so you can see where I sanded in there where those ejector pin marks were, and the only one that you can really see any evidence of is the one that's there towards the rear, and that gets covered by the air cylinders, so no issue whatsoever. But I have a couple of new pieces of flerm in my primer there that I need to take care of with my little sanding sponge trick. Back to the gripper tweezers and the little bit of sponge, and I'll just rub those out. And also, again, probably would not show, but just in the interest of demonstrating the techniques and what it takes for when it actually does matter. Yeah, it's a little stubborn. That little bit of sanding sponge might be getting clogged up. But for the most part, I think this is pretty good. I am pretty happy with this, with the way this piece has turned out. That's, you know, that's what I consider to be pretty acceptable. Now, when I shoot a layer of MRP Super Silver on it, because the back portion of a Spitfire cockpit back here is bare aluminum, we may see something different. Oh, let's take a look at this side and see how that's going. So this all looks pretty good, but what about this area where I had to do a little bit of fixing? It's not too bad. I think I got a little bit of a gouge there from my file. You can see right next to the panel line, but otherwise I'm pretty pleased with that. I think that's not a bad recovery from a stupid mistake. And you know, that's what it comes down to when you make a mistake like that, when you have a flaw. The bottom line is it's not ever going to be as perfect as the virgin plastic was. And so you just have to do your best. But it underscores another one of my kind of model making rules, and that is touch the parts as few times as possible. And again, as possible, you know, that's the operative phrase there. You got to do what you got to do, but you just cannot argue with the idea that the more times you touch something, the greater the odds are that you're going to screw it up. I mean, that's just statistically undeniable. And so the fewer operations you do, the better off you are. I mean, that's just a fact. So you'll see that basic philosophy, rule, whatever you want to call it, kind of pervade everything that I do. And so, you know, unfortunately, when you make a mistake, you're forced into making additional touches. And so what you have to hope for is that in the process of touching the thing in the additional places and times necessary to fix whatever you screwed up, that you don't in fact make things even worse. So anyway, I'm just rambling while I work. I apologize. It is what it is, but I think that's not too bad. And this piece, I think, can go forward. All right, now let's take a look at this one where I showed that little trick of using some spray filler there. You can kind of see the results of that divot, and there's a couple of little pieces of flurm there from the whole scribing process. Scribing, scraping, whatever. I mean, that's just, that's again, that goes back to the fact that you simply cannot touch a part without leaving some evidence of having done that. And, you know, even if that's just a little stray bit of dust or something that wasn't there before, you know, it happened because you were there. It is the evidence of your passing, and it's just part of it. And the difference comes in how sharp your eyes are in noticing those things, and how dedicated you are to spending the time and effort to take care of them. Sometimes it can seem like a real, you know, game of whack-a-mole, spotting and fixing flaws, and it can get frustrating. But that's, to me, that's the difference between, you know, just merely competent craftsmanship and really, really good craftsmanship. Is it often just comes down to being willing to spend the time. And you can see, hopefully, now I've done a little bit of sanding there. You can see that this is coming up just fine. Now, this is a good moment maybe to talk about wet sanding versus dry sanding. Look, wet sanding is always, always better. Using water keeps your sandpaper from clogging up like that, even though it's pretty easy to just clean it off on your sleeve. The bottom line is water keeps that from happening. That makes the sandpaper cut better for longer. But the truth is that I don't wet sand nearly as much as I should because lazy. And there's just no other explanation than that. Now you can see where I'm getting some telltale kind of like ridges, like you can see there, that are, you know, evidence of the way that I scraped that, you know, leaving a little bit of an edge. And again, probably not going to show, but anytime you start operating on a piece of the bodywork the way that I was, you're going to change its shape. That's just inevitable. And if you're, you know, if it happens to enough of a degree that it's visible from miles away, then, you know, you're going to have to do something to repair it, build it back up. But at a minimum, what I'm showing you here is how you use primer to diagnose that. And ultimately, you know, the goal is to make it where it doesn't show, where it doesn't stick out like a sore thumb, where somebody who's, you know, looking at it in a photo or scrutinizing it on a contest table or whatever, does not look at it and go, wow, that's just bad craftsmanship. Just make it where it's not there anymore. So I think we've done a pretty decent job of that. But you can also see why I like to start with the spot priming early, because again, the sooner you start figuring out where your issues are, the better chance you have of making sure that they no longer exist by the time you get to where it really matters, and that is obviously when you go to put your color coat down. So there we go. I feel pretty good about that. But again, I won't feel 100% good about it until I shoot primer on it for the final time and I can see that it's all happy. All right, so what about these places where I showed you the spot spray trick in here? Not too bad. They leveled out quite a bit, and you know, again, honestly, for all things considered with this project, that would probably be fine the way it is. Either way, I'm not going to torture you with watching me sand it a little bit on camera. I think that is a good stopping place for this segment. And when I come back to it, we'll actually shoot some color. Well, not we. I will actually shoot some color.